Hello. People have been showing some interest in my YouTube channel, but particularly a video I made about racial equality, and I want to elaborate on that. Uh, I want to talk about my views on uh, African American history in the United States. Um, it's very important. It's very important to have an African American history month because African American history has been neglected. If you look at old history books or even more recent history books, there's things you don't see. One of the things that came as a surprise to me was the Tulsa, some people call it a riot, but it was kind of a massacre. The Tulsa Massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, um, was a very horrible thing. That angry white people just went crazy, and um, they went to what was called Black Wall Street. They went to this part of Tulsa where lots of African Americans lived, and they burned down buildings, and they killed people. It was horrible. And so it's something that was 1921. Look it up. It was in the New York Times. I know New York Times somehow is controversial now. But in any case, Black history is important and it has been neglected. And so it is important to study it. Now, there have been some controversial books have come out recently, well, in the last 20 years, um, which I found very interesting, and I thought they were both very well researched, but brought to my attention that uh, other things going on, um, mainly that, well, let me back up and just say a brief history of Black people in America, you know, started with the horrific experience of African Americans brought here as property from Africa long before we were even a country. So they were here. They were, they fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought in the Civil War. They fought in World War One. They fought in World War Two, um, and and Korea and Vietnam. Black people in America are Americans. And it's time for certain groups in this country to grow up and embrace that idea. And Black people, like everyone else, are entitled to be treated with respect. Um, certainly if you meet a person and they're a terrible person, you can choose not to respect an individual, but as a group, we need to respect each other as groups. Anyway, Black history very neglected the horrible experience of the enslaved people for not 5 years, not 10 years, but hundreds of years. People were bought and sold, treated horribly. And the first real success of the United States, my understanding is the great success of the United States came in the South, where they were growing cotton and they were growing tobacco. And those are very labor intensive crops. So they used slaves to harvest the cotton and to harvest and process the tobacco. The That was, I believe, a great deal of the wealth of the South before the Civil War, and the wealth of our country that sustained our country. And so, um, please keep that in mind. Um, and so slavery was horrible. We get to the Civil War, and the Civil War brought about some changes. And for a while, there was Reconstruction, and African Americans were doing some small numbers of African Americans were doing better. We had, I think, there were a few representatives to the Congress, uh, Black Americans, but then a new administration came into power in Washington, D.C. And that administration allowed the former slave owners and powerful people down in the South, powerful white people in the South, they allowed them to go back into the same roles they had before in government and so forth, so that a lot of the benefits that were gained in the Civil War were lost. And these powerful plantation owners and white people, they instituted what were called black codes, and those black codes were strict rules of behavior for Black Americans, and that when a Black American violated a black code, they were often arrested, and their punishment was often uh, to be put in the service of plantation owners, and a lot of them were back doing the same work that they were doing um, um, before the Civil War. And so um, there were the black codes, which lasted a long time and were used to control Black Americans. And voting voting became a thing that most Black Americans could not do, because if you voted, you might very well get lynched. But also, um, they put a lot of obstacles, the white people in charge put a lot of obstacles in the way for Black people to vote. So there's a lot to the Black codes, there's a lot to be studied. I am not an expert on history, I'm not an expert on Black American history, but I have done some reading. So after the Black codes came Jim Crow. The Supreme Court upheld in segregation in a huge way at one point, and that led to the separation of Black communities and white communities. Black people could not go to the white doctor. Black people could not go to the white schools, and the Black schools were hugely underfunded. The white people in charge got the money to go to the white schools. The Supreme Court said, well, as long as they can be separate, there can be segregation as long as the Black Americans were getting the same equal opportunities and equal funding and so forth as white. But obviously that didn't happen. Black schools were very limited in what they could do because they had very little money. And that carried on for like 100 years. And if your people are not educated, it's hard to encourage them to go and vote. And then again, with regard to voting during Jim Crow, um, a person, there were often obviously threats against any Black person who would vote. There were also rules that said the Black person, a person had to be literate in order to vote. Well, that was a means of keeping Black people from voting because they had not received a good education. Now, some did, but most had not received a good education because there was no funding. So it was a catch-22 situation. Jim Crow was horrible and again lasted like 100 years, where discrimination was just allowed. And another thing during Jim Crow, they would have fees to vote. And the Black people who really had not accumulated wealth, a lot of them had not accumulated wealth for many reasons, but also because of discrimination. They hadn't accumulated wealth. They didn't have the money to pay the poll taxes in order to vote. So again, the white people were in power all the way up until like the 1950s and 60s, when now the NAACP had lawyers who fought for years and years to try to do away with segregation because they knew that education was a big part of the puzzle. That if you could get equality in education, then Black people could be empowered to vote and change the dynamic of the situation. So eventually, the civil rights movement came along. I think it began in the 50s. And again, I'm not a genius, but the civil rights movement combined with legal action from the NAACP finally resulted in um, um, fair election laws and in desegregation of schools, which would allow Black people to go to white schools and get the better education because the money was being funneled to the white schools. So that's the first part of my thoughts on the history of Black Americans. Basically, read, recognize that it is important to uh, get that information about the Black experience in the United States because it wasn't handled in our history books. It wasn't emphasized. It was de-emphasized. So I'll probably do another video regarding what happened after the civil rights movement, but it'll be sketchy. I'm not an expert. I'm just a well-meaning person who'd like you to be informed. And I'd like to see white Americans step up. A lot of them have, and recognize that our country will not be great, will not be truly great until there is equality, equality in housing, equality in education, equal opportunities, and so forth. So thank you for listening.